Okay, hello, another week. We're already in week 6. I don't know if it's just me or is it time really going by very quickly. I don't know if it's related to the coronavirus or just getting old. Every time I turn around, it's breakfast. I summarized the comments from last week, and I will talk about that today if we have time at the end of the lecture. If not, tomorrow at the beginning of the tutorial session, I'll go through it. I summarized them all and made slides so we can discuss it. But today, we're turning to another aspect of this meaning, similar in some ways to speech acts, but a little bit different. So if you read this 10 reasons people are obsessed with this travel backpack. This is what's called a loaded question in logic. Why would we say this is a loaded question? What is it loaded with? What meaning do you have to create in order to make sense of this utterance, this question? Like if you were to answer it, what meaning would you have to take for granted in order to make sense of this question and answer it? Yeah?
Why are people obsessed with it?
Yeah, that's the question, is why are they obsessed with it? So what meaning do you have to take for granted in order to answer that question?
There are reasons why people are obsessed with it.
Not just that, go a little deeper.
People are already obsessed.
Yeah, the fact that people are obsessed with it. So you have to take for granted that people are obsessed with this backpack. And so this is a marketing ploy because they're making it sound like this may not be true at all. It's just they're making it sound like everybody loves this bag, they're so obsessed with this bag. And in order to answer this question, you have to take that for granted. You have to create that meaning in your mind, but not treat it as part of what's being asserted here or questioned here. You're taking it as kind of background information. You're presupposing it. So this is what's called a presupposition. You have to presuppose that information in order to make sense of the question in the first place, that there are people who are obsessing it. Because if there aren't people obsessing it, the question doesn't make sense at all, right? So this is what we're going to be talking about. And normally, I had actually prepared. I was going to wear T-shirts to class. I've done this in the past, and normally I would wear a T-shirt to class, and I would have a 15-minute discussion of things like question the questions. And one of the types of questions that I would talk about challenging is these kind of loaded questions when they ask you something. This is not just in advertising. This is even in linguistics, because Chomsky, for example, in setting up his whole research program, bases it on certain assumptions, like the so-called poverty of the stimulus, that he takes for granted and expects us to take for granted, but it's actually not an empirical assumption at all. It's actually false. And so his whole thing is based on these problematic, loaded questions. But the thing is, this semester, somehow timing hasn't been going that well. Trying to finish all the lectures on time, so I haven't been able to do that. But I promised in the beginning I would be talking more about this critical thinking. So I have a whole bunch of these T-shirts actually. Question the questions, question the answers, and question the unquestioned. And then I have a whole bunch more. I'm not going to show you all of them. Basically, I show you these only because today we are talking about questioning the questions, but at least there's one kind of question that has this presupposition kind of involved there. And we're going to be talking about presuppositions in today's lecture. So like in this one, Daddy's always said a bad word. Which one? And then the kid says, there's more than one. So why does your kid say there's more than one? Why did the kid all of a sudden say there's more than one? Yeah. So I'm not sure I heard everything he said, but what he's saying is which one is, there is a presupposition that there's more than one. So this is another kind of presupposition that when we ask questions like this one, like the WH question, sometimes there's a presupposition involved. In this case, picking from a number of bad words. And then the guy said, there's more than one, and said, yes, you doofus. Don't you listen when to mom when she's driving? Let's hear more about that. So that's the joke there. But for me, the interesting thing is there's more than one. So he gets the presupposition and knows that he has to create the presupposition that there's more than one in order to understand that question. And then he's surprised by the presupposition. So to him, the presupposition is actually new information. And this is another kind of presupposition. This is a letter from my crazy brother. That's redundant, actually. Both my brothers are crazy. I just thought of something. Neither you, nor me, nor Dad used a respirator while acid washing the pool. Yeah. I bought one to acid wash the pool. However, since we don't have a pool, I'm going to use it when cleaning the ovens. So the thing is, what's the problem? I bought it while washing the pool. So what's the presupposition there when you say I'm going to use it when washing the pool? Huh? Yeah, there's a presupposition that there's a pool. That's what we call an existential presupposition. That's different from the first kind of presupposition. That's an existential presupposition. We assume that the pool exists. Otherwise, why would you buy a respirator while acid washing the pool if there is no pool? So there's this existential presupposition. But he said, since we don't have a pool, I'm going to use it while cleaning the ovens. Okay, well, that's the thing. And then this one, online Christmas shopping is so easy. I used to spend hours hunting all over the mall for your gifts, but now I can buy the wrong stuff and never leave the house. How convenient for you. So this is, what's the presupposition here? I won't ask if it's true or false, although I know it's true. What's the presupposition here that he's kind of assuming in saying, so I can buy the wrong stuff and never leave the house?
He always gets the wrong things.
Yeah, he always gets the wrong things, right? So, and this is, like I said, it's true. I once bought my wife a purse, and she said, oh, this is really nice, but if it was a different color and a different shape, maybe different material, it would be even better, right? She's like, after that, I just give her the cash. It's like, don't bother, So this plays on a typical kind of stereotypical thing that guys never know how to buy stuff for their wives. And so that's the presupposition that's behind that. And this one is a little bit more sensitive here. This is about a new club that was announced. And it said the club president, Joel Lim, said it is not run from the top down, but instead from the bottom up. So this also involves a presupposition. Why would he say that? When we say something, we're usually reacting to something else. So what is the presupposition involved here? Yeah, so usually everything is run from the top down. So this one is going to be different, and that's why he has to mention it, because he's kind of going against the normal thing. And then this Brian Farvola, a famous footballer from Britain, was asked once how he spent all his money. He was ended up broke at the end of his career. And he said, they asked him, how did you spend all his money? He said, I spent most of it on birds, booze, and fast cars. The rest of it I squandered. Why is that funny? Or why is that not the way most of us think? Birds here means girls. Booze, the liquor, of course, and fast cars. So he spent most of his money like in bars and drinking and fooling around with women and driving fast cars or buying fast cars. And the rest I squandered. Why is it funny to say, and the rest I squandered? Yeah, because most people would think that this spending it on birds, booze, and fast cars is squandering. But for him, that's the solid stuff, and then the rest is squandering. I don't know what else it could be, what he's talking about in squandering, but it's a very famous quote. Because of that, violating our presupposition about what does it mean, what are the things that you're squandering about there. What is this? I think my battery just went dead. How about this one? Top A-level students are no longer shunning engineering. What's the presupposition here? Yeah, that previously A-level students were shunning engineering. So only the dummies were going into engineering. This one is a little bit more subtle, and this is why a cat will never be president. And he says, phew, as if he really had a chance to become president, right? So he was, the presupposition here would be as if he had a chance to become president when he really actually didn't. So there's no reason. Phew means that he's relieved in not having to become a president. Otherwise, he would be a president. So I gotta change my batteries in a minute, but I'll just use this. And then this one is a little bit sad. The School of Humanities and Social Sciences plays a big role in giving our students a broad education beyond their core discipline. What is the presupposition here? This is the attitude of the university toward SOH and SSS.
There's kind of two things, right? Firstly, because they're playing a big role, they're saying that usually you'd expect them to play a very small role. But also broad education beyond their core discipline assumes that you'd be focusing only on the core discipline.
Yeah, and what is the core discipline? So the humanities is what you study beyond your core discipline. So what is your core discipline then?
Do they mean your specific major?
I think what they mean here is your core discipline is going to be a STEM discipline, science, technology, engineering, and math. And humanities is just to kind of round that out. This is the way a lot of universities see humanities. It's just to kind of soften the engineers a little bit. Siri, I need to hide a body. What again? So what's this one involves a presupposition as well. When you say what again? So what's the presupposition there? Yeah, there was a previous case where you had to hide a body, right? So that's by just putting the again there, it evokes the presupposition that this is not the first time that this has been asked. And this one, you can't really read this, do I have a, no, it's a different one. It says, please do not shower here. Thank you for your understanding. This is a men's toilet on the 6th floor. There's no shower facilities there, but it says, please do not shower here. And I don't know what that is, but obviously the presupposition is that people would shower there if not told not to. So I definitely didn't take a shower. But it is, and then I like this one where they also tell you that this is where the lock is, because this one they had to tell you because in most of them, up is the lock, down is open. But this one you have to put it down as lock is, but somebody put it in differently. One more, I think. I think there's only one more. Hmm? If they meant do not wet the floor in a normal sense, they would say do not splash water on the floor rather than take a shower, right? Because you can make splash a lot of water without taking a shower and still think you're right. If their goal is to just not get water on the floor, then they should just say that. So obviously maybe some of the workers or something were showering there. I don't know. And this one, do not enter beyond this point for staff only. So when it says do not enter beyond this point for staff only, what's the presumption or presupposition about who is reading this? Yeah, that it's directed at somebody who's not a staff, because the staff don't have to pay attention to this. Oops. Okay, one more. So here, this is me talking with B, chatting with B. My mom just shrank 4 inches. I said, yikes. She was 5'4" and now she's my height, because B is 4'0". But mom's 86. You don't have any to lose. Why do you think I'm afraid? I'll become a midget. I said, become? And terrible, I should say. And then she said, become? And I said, just kidding. So when she says become, there's a presupposition there. So I was challenging her presupposition, but using the word become, there's a presupposition that she's not already a midget. I mean, we're always kidding within our group. She and Alice are always fighting who is the smallest one because they don't want to be small. I was asking B. The reason I found out she's 4 feet tall before this is there was a song in America that she's 4 feet 4 and don't need no more. And so I said, 5'4" and don't need no more. And I said, is that you, B? And she said, no, I don't even have that. I'm 5'0". No, what did she say? I'm 5 foot nothing and I'm really something, or something like that. Anyway, so, but by saying I'll become a midget, there's a presupposition that she's not already a midget. So then I questioned her presupposition by saying become with a question mark, and then she got that and was not happy. That's the way B really looks, actually. Okay, I keep trying to use them, but the battery's dead. So this is all about presupposition and connotation and other sorts of meaning that are evoked when you use a particular pattern. Let me just try changing these batteries, sorry. Somehow this is not working. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, so now the presupposition is another one of these weird things where earlier on in the 20th century, people, when they discovered this, and it was kind of a weird discovery that they thought, oh, this is something strange. They assumed, given their faulty assumption that all meaning is in the structure of sentences, that they didn't have the concept of pragmatics, so they assumed all meaning had to be in the structure. So they assumed that a presupposition is a proposition evoked by an utterance that is necessarily assumed to be true for the utterance to be evaluated as being true or false. So this is kind of the traditional thing, and they assume the presupposition is actually in the structure. And so then when they found problems with this definition, which I'll talk about in a minute, they tried to resolve it through structural means and finding structural ways of doing it, but it's really not structural at all. But let's look at some of these earlier things. So we have, for example, Bertrand Russell, famous philosopher, who wrote a paper in 1905 on reference, and he says when we use a definite description, we assume there is a referent for that definite description. So they talked a lot about this sentence, the King of France is bald. Is this true or false? Because remember I told you they had this idea that all sentences had to be true or false. But in the case of where there's an existential presupposition that's not true, in the sense of there is no King of France, can we say this sentence, the King of France is bald, is true or false? Or is it just nonsense? So they spent a lot of time and poured a lot of ink all over the place talking about this, because the King of France is using the King of France, like this assumes that there is a present King of France, and this presupposition is a precondition for the King of France is bald to be true. So in other words, to say that the King of France is bald is true, there has to be a King of France. And so then that's a problematic thing. How do we deal with a sentence like this then? So I'll come back to my own analysis of that, but that was the way they looked at it. So like the World Trade Center buildings were on the southern tip of Manhattan, presupposes that there were buildings that were part of the World Trade Center on the southern tip of Manhattan, or at least that there was something called the World Trade Center buildings. And the book he wrote was considered one of the best ever. There's a presupposition that he wrote a book. The president of the university is from the U.S. There's a presupposition that that there is a president of the university. So this is what we call the existential presupposition. And the negation of the clause does not affect that presupposition, the existential presupposition. So if I say the King of France is not bald, it still presupposes there is a King of France, just that he happened to have hair rather than being the bald one. And presupposition is also generally constant in questions and with modal kind of structures, and in most compound sentences formed by the connectives and, or, if, then. So is the present King of France bald is a question, and it still presupposes there is a King of France. If the present King of France is bald, then he doesn't need a comb, would presuppose for that to be true that there is a present King of France. But this is different from semantic entailment, which doesn't remain constant with negation. So if you say something like John punched Bill, that entails that Bill was punched, right? So an entailment is something that's necessarily true because of what you said, or it's basically what's a restatement of what you said in some way. Whereas we say John didn't punch Bill doesn't entail Bill was punched. So negation doesn't remain constant with entailment the way the existential presupposition does, because certain people try to assume that presupposition was entailment, but they really work very different. Semantically, they're different, and also in terms of like negation and questioning and all these other aspects where presupposition kind of stays constant, entailment doesn't. So there's also a second type of presupposition, what we call factive presupposition. This is the one that really got a lot of linguists involved. The first one was mainly for philosophers who were trying to talk about the truthness or falsity. We say falsity, we don't say truthity. We say truthfulness of sentences. Why can't we say truthity? I like that. So another thing that people got involved in is what we call factive presuppositions, and some clauses which contain verbs that take sentential subjects or objects often presuppose the truth of the embedded clause. So this is like the first example I gave you about why are so many people obsessed with this bag. Well, actually, no, we'll talk more about that one. That's a WH question word. WH question also has a similar factive thing, but let me talk about this type first. John realizes he made a mistake. If you say John realizes he made a mistake, then there is a presupposition that he made a mistake, or he realized he made a mistake. The truth of John made a mistake is assumed in saying he realized he made a mistake or he discovered he made a mistake. So there's certain types of verbs or predications that make this. And these were called factive verbs. So there are several types. The epistemic type, like I know that he grew a beard, or I realized he grew a beard, or I discovered he grew a beard, or I see that he grew a beard, or it's obvious that he grew a beard. So that he grew a beard is then a presupposition of that. It's factive. It's called factive just because it treats it as a fact. So they just made up this word factive because it treats the presupposition as a fact, something that's necessarily true. You have emotive verbs like he regretted growing the beard. He was glad he grew the beard. He was amazed that he was able to grow a beard. He was surprised that he was able to grow a beard. So in those cases, he grew a beard or was able to grow a beard is necessarily true. So it's a presupposition, factive presupposition. And certain verbs such as prove and mean in certain contexts can also be that. So he proved that John was the culprit. I just found out that John grew a beard. These are examples. So John grew a beard. He really regrets having that last glass of wine. So that presupposes he had a glass of wine. That he could speak so many languages amazed the audience. So here there's an assumption that he does speak many languages. So it doesn't matter whether it's the object of the verb or the subject of the verb, but that clause, like John grew a beard or have that last glass of wine or speak many languages, in it doesn't matter whether it's subject or object, it can be either one, so but it's all presupposed. With the existential presupposition, it actually helps for the existential presupposition for the thing to be the subject, because the subject is your topic, and usually you talk about something that exists. And that's actually the problem with the present King of France. I'll come back to that. That John wouldn't say anything in court proves that he has something to hide, so it shows that John wouldn't, it assumes John wouldn't say anything in court.
For B, if you took that as presupposing that he had more than one glass of wine, would that be a different type of presupposition?
That would be kind of an implicature from the fact that he had that last glass of wine. That usually you don't have the last glass of wine unless you've had more than one glass of wine. So yeah, that would be because when we make our inferences, there is actually a whole bunch of inferences. I'll talk more about that when we get to lecture 5. There's actually a whole bunch of inferences that you can make. There's stronger and weaker implicatures. And so this a weaker implicature, the stronger implicature would be that he had that last glass of wine. A weaker implicature would be that he had many glasses of wine. That the dean hasn't said anything to you yet means that he is waiting for the final committee's report. So the dean hasn't said anything to you. I didn't realize that you have only one leg. So you have only one leg. That's a presupposition. Oh, I forgot you are a vegetarian. Presuppose that you are a vegetarian. So all of these were seen as something to do with the verb. So they were called factive verbs, and it was the verbs that somehow made the statement that they took as an object or subject to be a fact. And so it was again seen as something in the structure, either the particular word used or the grammatical structure used. The contents of clauses subordinated by adverbial subordinators or relative pronouns are also presupposed. So this also, again, they're assuming it has to do with the structure. So the fact that grammatically it's subordinate clause or a relative clause, then they're assuming that it's the structure that makes it subordinate. That makes it presupposed. So when I was in the army, we had to get up at 5 a.m. every day. So that presupposes, you wouldn't say that if you weren't in the army, supposedly, right? This is according to them. So it has to be true that you were in the army. The car that you ran into was finally towed away. So here, there's a presupposition that you ran into the car. Just as I turned on the light, he fired the gun, presupposes you turned on the light. Right next to where you dumped the body was a police station. So there's a presupposition that you dumped the body. So all of these are subordinate clauses. So they're seeing this as just something in the structure of subordinate clauses. But this sort of presupposition is also constant on the negation and interrogation. So he doesn't realize he made a mistake, also presupposes he made a mistake, just like he does realize he made a mistake. Or does John realize he made a mistake as a question, but it still presupposes he made a mistake. So in these things, it seems to work, regardless of the structure. The constancy under negation and questioning holds for the presupposition. Now, WH question is also considered to involve this type of presupposition, like that first slide that I showed you. So what did John do? Assume John did something, or why is everybody obsessed with his bag? Assumes everyone is obsessed with the bag. And these differ from other prepositions, though, in that the negation does not involve the same presupposition, because it's everything except for the WH word in a WH question, like who, what, where, why, when. Everything but that is presupposed. So if you negate it, you have to negate it within the presupposed element. So that's why the presupposition changes if you negate something inside the presupposition. You're not negating the main. Outside that, the way you are with the others. So who left the cat out in the car assumes that somebody left the cat out in the car. Where did you dump the body? Assumed you dumped the body somewhere. what was the thing you stuck in his ear as soon as you stuck something in his ear? And this type is similar to another type, the presupposition associated with narrow information focus. So when we haven't talked yet about focus structure, but in lecture 6, we're going to talk about information structure a little bit. And what information structure is how you package the kind of new versus old information in what you say. And so in English, the way we mark this largely is by intonation. So in different contexts, you might have what I call narrow information focus here is when you have like emphasis on one thing. So if I say like John is working in his study, where you put a heavy emphasis on study, then if you know that he's working somewhere, and then the answer is like, where are you working? Where's John working? You say, oh, John is working in his study. Then the only new piece of information is the study, and that has to be linked to the rest of it. But that's what we call narrow focus, because only that part is in focus, as opposed to what is John doing? And I say John is working in his study. Then everything after the word John is in focus in that sentence. So it depends on the context. It's pragmatics. It's not in the structure itself. So this type does not remain constant under negation, because again, what's being negated is the part that's in the presupposition. So everything but the word study in this example is presupposed. So if you change the negation of what's presupposed, then it's going to change the meaning. So it's unlike the other ones where we weren't putting the negation in the presupposed part. Now this is true of cleft constructions as well, because they're also a narrow focus construction. Such statements have the same presuppositions as explicit or implicit questions towards the answer. So if somebody asked you who won the game, and you say the Giants won the game, or it was the Giants who won the game. So it was the Giants who won the game is a cleft construction. Or the Giants are the one who won the game. That's another kind of cleft construction. Cleft just means to be cut. Right? So cleaver, you know the word cleaver? And then cleaver is a knife, and then you cleave something is to cut it. And something is cleft, it's the past participle of cut. So something that is cut, a cleft construction is a sentence that's been cut in half and rearranged. So the Giants won the game is kind of straightforward. It was the Giants who won the game, or the Giants are the one who won the game would be a cleft construction. And also when you have like this contrastive focus, that's also narrow focus. Like, did he break the water glass? No, it was the wine glass that broke, or the wine glass broke. But they both assume something broke. It was the wine glass that broke, so you can use any one of those structures. And the Giants were the ones who won the game. And certain temporal particles, this goes to the example we saw about again, burying the body again. Generally, iterative or continuative can also evoke presuppositions. So if I ask you, are you still cheating on exams? That's a kind of insulting question, because it implies that it presupposes that you have been cheating on exams in the past. And so I'm just asking if you still are cheating on exams. Did you cheat again? If you use the word again, like in the Siri example, if you use the word again, that presupposes that the situation happened at least once before. Or even if you say something like once more, the dean granted him leave, then you know the speaker is presupposing that the dean had granted him leave at least once before that. The presupposition that the proposition expressed by a subordinate clause is not true is evoked by the counterfactual if clause and by the counterfactual verb pretend. So in this case, if you say something like, if he had stopped at that point, he would have been okay, presupposes that first part, in this one, if he had stopped at that point, presupposes that he did not stop at that point. That's why the if is there. So the if is what we call a counterfactual if. So if you have a counterfactual if, it presupposes that the opposite of what is stated in the if clause is the actual truth. So that's a counterfactual statement or counterfactual if clause. So if he had stopped at that point, presupposes that he did not stop at that point. This is a little bit different, a little bit trickier. Then he would have been okay. He didn't stop at that point. If they had had gunpowder at that time, history would have been different. So that presupposes they didn't have gunpowder at that time. Pretend he had stopped at that time. Do you think he would have been okay? So if you have to pretend something was the case, then that means it wasn't really the case, right? So that's pretty straightforward. It's just like if, right? You wouldn't say if it really was the case, and you wouldn't say pretend something if that was the case. So if you say pretend he stopped at that time, it means he didn't stop at that time. Or he pretended he knew the answer, which implies that, or it presupposes that he doesn't know the answer. We're going to be talking about these in lecture. I keep saying implies because, or implicates, because when we get to lecture 5, we're going to see this in a little different way in terms of implicature. Okay, so the traditional way that they looked at these presuppositions is that they had certain properties. They are meaning that is not asserted, questioned, or ordered, but taken for granted. Some people say they are entailed in a kind of formal semantic analysis, but in the pragmatic analysis, we just say they're assumed or taken for granted. 2, they are generally constant under negation and with different speech acts. So depending on whether you're questioning or making a statement or asking a question, the presupposition stays the same. And if you negate it, it also stays the same. But you have to be negating not the presupposition part itself, but the main clause, like he didn't realize he fell off the table, or he fell off the table. They cannot be denied without evident self-contradiction, but can be suspended in conditional clauses. So you can't say the Giants won the game, but nobody won the game, right? Because by saying the Giants won the game, with Giants as a narrow focus, there's a presupposition that somebody won the game. So you can't then assume that somebody won the game and then say nobody won the game. Unless your goal is to negate the presupposition, which we do sometimes. But then you would probably say, because nobody won the game. Then you would say, like, the Giants did, you couldn't say that, well, I'd say the Giants didn't win the game because nobody won the game. I just found out that John grew a beard, but John didn't grow a beard, right? So that we wouldn't say, because if you say, I just found out that John grew a beard, it presupposes that John grew a beard. And what's in question here is just whether or not you know it, or when did you find out about it or not. You're just stating that you found out about that fact. So in this case, you're not, you can't really do that. But you can say something like, the president of the university is from the US, if in fact there is a president of the university. So in this case, you're questioning the existential presupposition. So this is the case of the existential presupposition, when you say the president of the university is from the US, if in fact there's a president of the university. So by putting that if clause there, you're saying, well, I'm making a statement that involves a presupposition, but I'm not really sure the presupposition is true. So that's kind of what you're saying when you say this, if, there is a president of the university. That the dean hasn't said anything to you yet means that he is waiting for the final committee's report, if in fact the dean hasn't said anything to you. So in this case, you may not know whether the dean has actually said anything or not, but you kind of reserve you mentioned the presupposition involved in the second part of, that sets up the scene for the second part of the sentence. But then you can hedge it by saying, if in fact the dean hasn't said anything to you. And presuppositions are relative to an assumed world. It could be the real world, assuming there's only one real world. They put it a dream world, a suppositional world, or a conditional world, right? So we can say, I dreamed that Apple had won the marketing wars and was happy to see Bill Gates struggling to keep his company afloat. This goes back a ways. This example is from the days when Apple actually almost went out of business because they only had 8% of the market share the days before Apple iPhone. And Bill Gates was winning, but actually Bill Gates is the one who saved Apple in those days. He invested $150 million to save Apple from going out of business. Can you imagine that? The world has changed a bit since then. But the reason why Bill Gates did that was because first of all, he uses Apple as his research and development arm. And also because he would be charged with antitrust laws, in other words, monopolizing the computer industry if you didn't have some viable competition. Anyway, that's a side tangent. But the thing is, I dreamed that Apple had won the marketing wars. In that dream world, if you set up that world and that Apple had won the marketing wars, that's just setting up your dream world. Was happy to see Bill Gates struggling to keep his company afloat. So the presupposition here is that Bill Gates was struggling to keep his company afloat. And so that proposition only holds within the dream world that you have set up by saying, I dreamed that Apple had won the marketing wars. Or what if you say what if, or suppose Apple had won the marketing wars, seeing Bill Gates struggling to keep his company afloat would be great. So here again, Bill Gates struggling to keep his company afloat is presupposed, but it's set up within the world set up by this suppose or what if dream world. If Hong Kong had a real democracy, Hong Kong's publicly elected chief executive would be more responsive to the needs of the public. And then when I graduate, my gown will be trimmed in gold. So here, my gown, the existential presupposition of having a gown is only relative or only holds in the world of the graduation, which hasn't happened yet. So when I graduate, so in that future world, my gown will exist and it will be trimmed in gold. Okay, so originally prepositions were thought to be properties of words or sentences, as I mentioned earlier. And so they were seen as semantic, because anything that could be, and semantic here was not really about meaning so much as compositional semantics, where they thought it was a part of the structure of words and sentences. And some people said it was to be entailed by a sentence and its negation. But there's a difference between presupposition and entailment, as we mentioned earlier. With an entailment, asserting the entailment is relatively uninformative, but it's a valid argument. So I can say John worked for 5 hours, therefore John worked for 4 hours. That's an entailment. If he worked for 5 hours, he necessarily worked for 4 hours and even more. But it's not wrong, and it's not it's a valid argument. It's valid to say, therefore, John works for 4 hours. It's just really boring and uninformative because it's kind of necessarily the case. But presuppositions, asserting a presupposition results in an invalid argument. So that he could speak so many languages amazed the audience. Therefore, he speaks many languages. Now, the reason why this difference exists, now they're doing this from a totally semantic point of view. But if you think about the pragmatics of this, in the first case, John worked for 5 hours. You're asserting that he worked for 5 hours. So that there's an illocutionary force there. So this is part of your assertion. It's what's being asserted. And so therefore, you can restate that. You can use that as part of your argument because that's what's being asserted. Whereas that he could speak many languages amazed the audience. He's not asserting that he could speak a lot of languages. He was asserting that the audience was amazed. So if you're going to draw any conclusion from that he could speak so many languages amazed the audience, you have to base it on what was asserted, not on what was presupposed. So saying, therefore, he speaks many languages would be trying to make an argument based on what was presupposed rather than what was asserted. And so that's invalid. So these things really work very differently. And not all sentence types can be negated. So to say that, this make negation, or the constancy under negation, a key factor is problematic. So you can't really negate something like, to hell with the governor of New York, or standing there was the governor of New York, you wouldn't say not standing there was the governor of New York. I suppose you could in a comedic kind of way. It's also problematic to define presupposition as being entailed by the sentence and its negation. It's like I said, with negation, entailment is something very different. It's what is being asserted. It's not what is being presupposed. With WH questions, the presupposition is different under negation. So what did John do presupposes John did something, but what didn't John do presupposes John didn't do something, because the negation is placed within the element talking about the item that's supposedly presupposed. Did John do or didn't John do? Whereas with the other ones, when you negated it, like I didn't discover the book was on the table, or I did discover the book was on the table, you're not negating the part about the book was on the table. If you actually put the negation there, I discovered the book was not on the table, then you do change the presupposition. So somehow they couldn't see the difference when they were talking about these things. It depends on where you put the negation. It's also problematic to define presupposition as properties of phrases or sentences, as the same exact phrases or sentence in different contexts may or may not have the presupposition. So if you say, I'm not sure of the ending of the movie, maybe he discovered that the butler did it. So if you say he discovered that the butler did it, then it presupposes the butler did it. But if you say, maybe he discovered that the butler did it, there's no presupposition that the butler did it. So how can it be the structure itself that he discovered the butler did it, that the word discovered is the thing that triggers the presupposition? That must be why he did it. He discovered the butler did it. No, maybe that's not it. So even by adding another sentence, you can negate the presupposition in that sense. Joan said Bill's brother met her at the airport, but Bill doesn't have any brothers. So here again, you're questioning or challenging the presupposition that Bill has a brother. So you can do these kind of things. And it shows that the presupposition is not in the structure itself. And existential presuppositions are related to reference. And just as reference is always in principle context dependent and dependent on inferring the speaker's intention, so is presupposition. Presupposition is a matter of the interpretation of utterances, not something in the sentences. In other words, it's understanding the speaker's intention. So before we can talk about whether a statement has a determinable truth value, we need to determine its information structure and the context it was spoken in. So what's being said about what depends on the information structure. So if you say the King of France is bald, where you're assuming the existence of the King of France, that's one thing. That would be where the King of France is bald, where you're taking the King of France presupposed and you're saying he's bald. That involves this existential presupposition, and you could say that's not true. There's no King of France. But if the King of France, if your question is something like which of the heads of Europe are bald, and you say the King of France is bald, this is the actual example I have here, where the France is accented, the King of France is bald, then there is no presupposition that there is a King of France, because it's in focus. This is again a narrow focus type of thing. So the part of somebody's bald is presupposed, but not who is bald. So then you can say it's not true. There is no King of France. So that's a valid interaction there. So it all depends on the information structure, whether the King of France is the topic and therefore presupposed, or it's the focus and not presupposed. Joan said Bill's brother met her at the airport, but Bill doesn't have any brothers. There's no presupposition that Bill has brothers, only that Joan thinks Bill has a brother. So again, trying to say that all the meaning is in the words and stuff is really problematic. It's really about inferring the intentions of the speakers. Presuppositions also don't have to be true. What is necessary is for them to be treated as assumed to be held as true in some world or by some person. So in 12, Jim just discovered that the president of the university is a snake demon in human disguise. The presupposition may be false, but the sentence is still grammatical and meaningful. They also don't have to be common knowledge, as they can be used to inform somebody or of something in an indirect way. So Donald Trump often does this. He'll say, nobody knows that something. This actually means he didn't know it until 10 minutes ago. But he'll say, few people know that the Nile is the only river in the world that runs north to south. So you can do this, like if you're giving a talk or something, you can start off by saying, few people know that the Nile is the only river in the world that runs north to south, south to north. As a way of telling people that the Nile is the only river in the world that runs south to north, because few people actually know that. So you're actually presupposing that information, but you're letting people become aware of it in a polite way. So rather than saying, none of you know this, and I'm going to tell you this, you can just kind of indirectly tell people that. Or when you say to somebody, have you noticed that your fly is open? Where the presupposition is that your fly is open. It's just the question is, have you noticed it or not? So with presupposition, the speaker is taking some aspect of what she or he is saying as being already assumable and not controversial. And the hearer infers that the speaker is taking that proposition as assumable, taking it for granted, even if the hearer didn't know it before or doesn't agree with it. So it's really very much just a pragmatic creation of meaning aspect, right? So you're creating a particular bit of meaning in order to make sense of the person's intention. Even if you don't know whether it's true or false, but if the person presents it in a particular way that you can infer that they are taking it for granted, then it's up to you whether you take it for granted or not. So that's the basic idea of what they traditionally call presuppositions. My take on it. And there's some other things that aren't traditionally associated with presuppositions, but Green does treat them together in the same chapter, so I'll mention them. And to some extent, they're all about meaning creation of a similar type. In other words, kind of preconditioned meaning creation, not preconditioned, but habituated or conventionalized meaning creation associated with certain patterns. So like if you, with certain like presuppositions associated with the use of particular words, like assassinate. So you only use the word assassinate if the person who was killed is of high political office or there is some other political motivation for the killing, and the killing is intentional. You can't assassinate somebody by accident, right? Just like murder, right? So when you murder somebody, it's not, the whole difference between homicide and murder is one is intentional, one is not intentional. So these are, even legally, this is how it works in the law. So to assassinate somebody or to murder somebody has to be intentional, and with assassinate, the person has to be somebody important, and usually the killing is for a political purpose. And then there are other kinds of connotations. Like in Japanese, if you use the word san after somebody, they would say, "Oh, have you seen Ikea-san?" or something like that. Then there's a presupposition that you know the person who you just mentioned, right? So you wouldn't use san after somebody's name if you didn't know that person personally. Does you understand that? So, so it's just like in English. If we're talking about somebody that maybe they don't both know, you would not use the first name generally of that person unless you both were friendly with that person, right? So if I'm talking to you about Peter Trudgill, I would normally talk about him as Trudgill. I wouldn't call him Peter unless I thought you knew Peter, right? And it would assume that I knew Peter, actually. That's even a stronger assumption or presupposition that I know Peter if I'm calling him Peter. So there's this, you'll see people do this in the entertainment field where they'll use names to call somebody, like well, now it's popular for people to use first names anyway, but in Taiwan, they'll call somebody like 大姐, or older sister or something like that, which gives the assumption that they know the person well. Otherwise, why would you call them 大姐, older sister? But it might be broader. So like Zhang Hui, a famous singer in Taiwan who's a little bit older, everybody calls her 大姐. So it may be just that has spread. I'm not really sure yet. The use of all presupposes that it's not both. Now this is something that that non-natives don't often get. That when you say all, that means not two. In a lot of languages, they don't distinguish between two and more than two. So like in Chinese, you would say dou, could be just two people. But in English, we make a clear distinction between just two people and more than two people. So all presupposes there's at least three references. Or managed. When you say he managed to get the job done, presupposes that the job was difficult. Otherwise, you wouldn't use the word managed. So these are kind of not conditions on the use of the word, but a little bit like conditions on the use of the word. But from the hearer's point of view, it's like he wouldn't use that word unless he intended for me to create that meaning. So it's just, he said he managed to get it done. It could be done, and it could be used, of course, in a humorous way sometimes. I managed to eat the whole box of ice cream. You can say that and be understood, but there's still that kind of implication or implicature or whatever you want to call it, assumed meaning that it was a difficult job. And so there's some controversy as to whether these are presuppositions proper or more like preparatory conditions on illocutionary acts. There are also similar, like preposition like phenomena, which might be better seen as conditions on speech acts. Like when someone says turn on the light, there is an assumption that the light is not already on. And you'll see this, like if the lights are on and I say turn on the light, people, and the light's already on, people will go like, what's going on? Because they'll think the lights are already on. Why is he saying this? It seems incongruous because there is kind of a presupposition that the lights must be off to say that turn the lights on. So that could be considered something like either a speech act precondition or a presupposition. The use of particular pronouns and honorific forms in certain languages, such as Japanese, also assumes that there's a particular status relationship between the speech act participants. So when you use a more formal expression like in 14a or a less formal expression like in 14b, there's going to be a presupposition about or an assumption about who you're talking to, that you're using the right level of politeness. In Japanese, they often teach foreigners that there's a neutral level of politeness. There's no neutral level. You have to pick the right level of politeness. They'll be forgiving because they think foreigners are dumb anyway. But they'll be forgiving if you use the wrong politeness level. But there is no neutral politeness level. You should really learn all the different levels and use the correct one at all times. So that's a kind of presupposition. So when you meet somebody, you kind of have to know who they are in relation to you, so you know how to talk to them. And this is true of a lot of languages, that you to do this. And it's being lost in Chinese. In Chinese, it used to be much more prevalent, especially in writing. I just had some correspondence with somebody in China, and I used a more formal kind of way of writing, where you distinguish the kind of generations or status. And so this was a young scholar who had written to me about something. So when I replied, I used kind of a more formal, because I don't know the person. So I used a more formal and a more kind of senior talking to junior style level of politeness. But he responded in junior to junior kind of level, or the same level kind of thing. So it shows that he either hasn't mastered the system, because a lot of it's being lost now in China. They just write anything they want to anybody, they're not using that system anymore. Or he just doesn't treat me respectfully. That's also possible. Although restrictive relative clauses involve presupposition, non-restrictive relative clauses do not, as they are asserted rather than taken for granted. So it's not. So you know the difference between restrictive and non-restrictive relatives, right? So like this student who scored a consistent 100 points on all the exams has been chosen to be a tutor for the other students. So in English, we mark non-restrictive relative clauses very clearly by either a pause in speech after the head noun, or a comma. So like this student, comma, who scored a consistent 100 points on the exam, that part, who scored a consistent 100 points on the exam, is not presupposed because it's being asserted. It's actually new information that's being added to the referent. Whereas with a restrictive relative clause, the information is already presupposed because it's helping the hearer to identify the referent. They're doing something very different in discourse. So that's why we call it restrictive versus non-restricted relative clause. You would have learned about this in structured English? Yes? No? So they're structurally very different also. A restrictive relative clause is within the noun phrase. A non-restrictive relative clause is at the clause level. So these things, because they're asserted and not presupposed, they don't involve presupposition. Or I left my car, which happened to be low on gas, at home today. So the which happened to be low on gas is not presupposed, it's just asserted separately from I left my car at home. But it's considered, the reason why you put it in a non-restrictive relative clause is just because it kind of gives it lower information status, but it's still asserted information. I'm going to skip this one. So in terms of these presuppositions, this book called Pragmatics, he tried to break these down into these different types: existential, factive, non-factive, lexical, structural, and counterfactual, and then gave examples, and then the type of presupposition involved. And so the chicken curry for this week, in other words, your takeaway this week, is a revised definition of presuppositions. It's the meaning that the communicator intends for the addressee to infer, but treat as assumed background knowledge, even if it isn't. Right? So that's very different if you read, again, the definition given in the beginning and then this definition at the end. They're quite different. Okay. All right, any questions about that? About presupposition? Yeah?
So relating to the topic about, so we say the fact, so which one, can you also say that it is implied that there are more than two?
Yeah. So in this one, it's more than one. So if you say which, then the which by itself also, there's one of these things about these connotations. If you say which or which one, then there must be more than one to choose from. Like if there's only one of something, then you wouldn't say which one. You have to say, okay, out of these things, which one do you want? Or which one are you talking about? So that's the connotation. That's more like the connotation of manage or something like that.
So is it more of an implication or presupposition?
More like well, it's this whole question of how do we want to treat those things. From my point of view, they all fit this definition, in the sense that it's meaning you have to create in order to understand what the speaker is saying. So the communicator intends for you to create that meaning and use it as background knowledge in order to understand the question or statement or whatever it is. So that's basically covers a lot of that stuff. And that includes those things that some people may call connotation or speech act or whatever. It's anything any meaning you need to create in order to understand the speaker's intention. Any other comments, questions?
I don't understand the part about asserting the presupposition.
About the what?
Asserting the presupposition, like the one about the.
Which slide? Which slide are you looking at? Is there a number? Did I forget to number them?
Yeah. This one after the nature of this.
The one after this.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the difference between entailment and the presupposition. So entailment is something that's part of the asserted information, right? So if I say John worked for 5 hours, I'm asserting John worked for 5 hours. So I can then make an argument that because you're saying John worked for 5 hours, I can therefore draw the conclusion that John worked for 4 hours. That's an entailment. But with a presupposition, you're not asserting the presupposition. So when I say that he could speak so many languages, amaze the audience, what I'm asserting is that he amazed the audience. Or this fact about him amazed the audience. So I can't then draw a conclusion from something that I'm presupposing. If I want to draw a conclusion that, from that fact amazed the audience, therefore they really liked him or something like that, then the thing that follows must follow from in other words, the argument must follow from what's being asserted, not from what's being presupposed.
So the therefore would be about amazing the audience.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments, questions? No. Okay, so we have oh yeah, go ahead.
Just now you said back about the last glass of wine, right?
Yeah.
Before someone asked about it, and then you said that the guy had more than one glass of wine.
Right.
Implicature. Is that still a presupposition?
Yeah, okay. So this is where things get a little bit messy. So when we talk about presupposition as a separate phenomenon, then we have problems with something like that. So when we get to lesson 5, and what I'm giving to you already in my revised definition is a much broader thing, which includes not just presupposition, but just about everything we're talking about. That everything goes back to inferring the reason for the speaker using the form of the ostensive act that they did. So it all goes back to that. And so from what we're going to talk about in lecture 5 in week 8, because we have a quiz after this week. Well, first we have the break, right? Or is that this week? Next week? This is week 6 or 7? 6. This is week 7? Oh, okay. All right, so we have break next week. Oh, yeah. Okay, so then we have the quiz after the break, and then we have lecture 5. So in lecture 5, what I'm going to do is talk about all this stuff again from the point of view of implicature, and say that all of this is just types of implicature. I'm talking to you, actually. He's nodding, so I was looking at him, but you were the one who asked the question. Different types of implicature. This is part of what I'm saying in this whole course, is that we don't really need to treat each of these phenomena that I'm talking about as separate phenomena. It's all part of the same principle that we use abductive inference to infer the speaker's intention, regardless of all of these phenomena that they try to kind of package as separate things and have separate explanations for each one of them.
So it's both like the weak implicature and presupposition?
Yeah. So it's weak implicature is the way I would describe that one. Yeah. So it's the same thing. It's just information that you create in order to make sense of the other person's whatever they did, the ostensive act. Okay, so we have some time. Any more before? Oh yeah. Okay.
Did your family ever have a pool? So did your brother move?
We had a pool for a time, yeah, when I was a kid. But my brother, he never cleaned the pool, if that's what you mean, that I remember. I did that most of the time. He's younger than me, quite a bit younger. So I don't know where he got that idea, but he did talk about my father. He claims to have a memory going back to the time he was 2 years old, whereas I can't remember last week. And so he tells me lots of stuff about our past that I don't know anything about. I don't remember. But he might be just making it up because he knows my memory sucks. But I don't know. But yeah, maybe it has something to do with we had a pool. Okay, now I just want to do this summary of the feedback. Yeah, another question.
I just want to ask, can adjectives be presupposing? Like if I always do something very stupid, can I say passive domina? Not presupposing that I always do something.
I can't really hear. Wait, can you pass this back there? Hello, hello. Is this on? Hello.
Yeah, I just
Hello, hello. Yeah, can you, somebody, because I'm tethered here, can somebody bring that back?
I just want to ask, can adjectives be presupposing?